So we're going to start tonight's series on walking by faith. It's the study of Hebrews, but more specifically Hebrews chapter 11. And so just give you an overview of the quarter. We have 10 classes, 10 because 2 months we'll have Sunday night, second Sunday service night, okay? And I'll be sharing the lessons with Augustine. We'll be delivering you the following classes. We'll do an introduction, kind of a fast and furious review of Hebrews in totality, which gives you a little bit of context. Then of what we oftentimes call as the honor roll of faith. We're going to then take a deep dive into various patriarchs, men and women of the Bible, who have demonstrated faith, walking in faith. We will use a lot of the Old Testament, which will be fun. We'll go back and we'll explore these men and women of the Bible and how, you know, they had faced different obstacles. They were given different instructions, but they had one thing in common, and that was walking in faith. So that's an overview. And then in the last class, we'll circle back on Christians and try to draw applications to us today. All right, any questions? All right, let's do I think we'll do a 10-minute fast and furious overview of Hebrews. We don't know who actually wrote it. A lot of scholars believe it's Paul. A few people think other things, but it's largely Paul. It was written before AD 70, before the temple was destroyed, which is interesting and has a lot of context as you read through it. But to give a quick overview, we're going to do a quick overview of Hebrews. So let's watch.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was, or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah, and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the promised land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this. Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily, but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, They're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
Thank you. Quick sidebar. Big thanks to Justin and the broader AV team. It's awesome that we can come here and have all this cool technology and be able to worship God throughout the service seamlessly. So big thanks to them. 10-minute overview of Hebrews. But I think it's really helpful to give that context of why then we would go deep into Hebrews 11. Those men and women of faith had some things in common with the church that likely Paul was writing to these Hebrews, but also to us today. Some themes that I think are important. Two of those themes came from that video. I added one because I think it's pervasive. But the first theme is that elevating Jesus as superior. In fact, just to kind of one verse reinforce this, let's go to the right after Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 12, notice how it describes faith as it relates to Jesus. So could I get somebody to read? I'll just read it, actually. So go to Hebrews chapter 12. And it says in verse 1 and 2, therefore also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now here's the point. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Think about that. The author and the finisher of our faith. So the topic here we're going to study this quarter is really about faith. We're going to look at the men and women, but the object of our faith is Jesus. So key theme of this whole book is that Jesus is superior. Second, it's to challenge the reader to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. Here in a little bit, we're going to read the context of chapter 11. Just before chapter 11, there's an exhortation, and it acknowledges the persecution and the suffering of those Hebrews. And last, and this is pervasive throughout the book, but to strengthen our hope in the promises of God. Of all the books of the New Testament, now I'm not perfect, but I did a word search and I looked, roughly about 35% of all references to promises of God comes in the book of Hebrews, which is kind of interesting. It's a pervasive thing from start to finish. As we watch that video, you notice how it had lots of different men and women throughout history. They were all given promises. And God's promises are what? Faithful and true, right? So that's the themes of the book. But what is faith? I started with Webster's dictionary. And I got two. One is a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. Second, something that is believed, especially with strong conviction. So a little bit of cutoff there, but is this definition consistent with what we read in the Bible? Go ahead, Ed, say more. Can you elaborate?
Faith is the substance of things hoped for, not seen.
And the evidence.
We have the evidence of God's word.
Great. So this whole, on the first one, the notion of there is no proof, that flies in the face, or is the opposite of the biblical definition. We'll explore that more. Anyone else? Matt, it looks like you want to say something? No? No, sorry.
I think the second one is okay. if you can believe with a strong conviction, even if there is proof.
Yep, that's a really good point. There is a strong conviction, and I like the word conviction, so that's a good point. Anyone else? All right. So what I thought we would do is we would go to the Bible and read several verses and build our own definition. Can I get a volunteer to read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1? Great. So a couple things there. The substance of things hoped for. Does anyone have and then the evidence of things not seen? What is the writer referring to? Things not seen. What are not seen? Well, God's not seen, right? Evidence of God. What else is not seen? That's right. So while we can't see God, we have evidence all around us by the things he's made. Somebody said once, you can't have a design without a designer. You can't have, Robert isn't here today, but he's an artist. You can't have art without an artist, right? Augustine's a software coder and designer, developer. You can't have code without a coder, right? Go ahead.
So I always thought that this was a reference to the Jews. They knew Ruach, the word Ruach, or the Spirit of God, the Spirit of God. And so I always kind of put that evidence that we know that the Spirit of God was in motion. I mean, he did a lot of things in motion, where he took different people, and he was there on the forming of the earth, where he's there in our lives. So there's a lot of things that the Spirit of God is there, but we don't see the Spirit of God. We don't see that ruach, that spiritual energy from God.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I'm not going to go deep into this, but there's a lot of evidence. But the point is it's founded on evidence. There's a lot of different genres of evidence, right? There's scientific evidence. There's logical evidence. There's medical evidence. There's, frankly, linguistic evidence. There's archaeology. The list goes on, but there's a plethora of evidence. Let's go to the next verse. James chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. Could I get a volunteer to read that?
Now Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar. Do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works, faith was made perfect.
Perfect. That last piece is important. Faith was made perfect. The reference here is with Abraham. He goes on to then talk about Rahab as well. We're going to explore that in later lessons. But I love I think the ESV says faith was completed, but faith was perfected is probably a better translation. Any comments there? Well, here, we'll notice that every single person in the honor roll of faith throughout this series, this quarter, they were justified by their faith, but the description of that justification was in their actions, by the things they did. Make sense? To reinforce this point, I thought we'd read Hebrews chapter 3, verses 18 through 19. Can I get a volunteer for that?
And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief.
Perfect. The reference here is of the Israelites wandering in the desert. They didn't believe God to enter God's rest, God's promise, the promised land of Canaan. And so he left them in the desert, and they all died except for two people. Does anyone remember who those two people were? Caleb and Joshua, the two people who believed in God. Notice, I think it's in verse 19, what does the writer equate unbelief to? Exactly. Disobedience to the unbelief. The flip of that would be obedience with belief. It's connected with what we just read in James. Our faith is, Abraham was justified by his faith by what he did. So we see that his works were perfected his faith. Well, our obedience, here we see that obedience perfects our belief. Very similar, perfects our faith. And the reverse of that is disobedience. And those who did not obey God died in the desert. We'll have more to talk about that later. Next verse. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Can I get somebody to read that?
But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
Great. So you have to have faith to please God. And what are the two conditions, Matt?
Must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
Isn't that awesome? So not only do we have to believe that he exists, which we talked earlier about the evidence of God. There's lots of evidence, but we got to believe our faith is tied to belief that he exists and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Remember, we were talking about the promises of God? So much of Christianity, and frankly, from the beginning of the Bible, was hinged on just the faith and the promises of God. Can't hardly read that, but could I get somebody to read Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 19? This is my favorite part. I think this brings it home. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 19.
For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessings, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which enters the presence behind the veil.
Great. There's a really wonderful song that we sing. You know, the anchor of the hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, in which enters the presence behind the veil. It hinges on the strength of God's promises. Our faith does. So if we put all that together, here's a proposed definition, biblical definition of faith. A convicting belief that produces obedience based on the evidence God exists and the hope and the rewards he has promised. Any questions, any thoughts? Anyone?
Not only because it's more than just knowledge that God is there, but that he is active in our lives and we can put our faith in him. So I like that. Going back to the Israelites who had died in the wilderness, going back to that story, you remember that they brought back the grapes from the land of promise, but it never tells us that they tasted those grapes. They brought them back, they knew they were there, but they never experienced the blessings of the promised land.
Yeah.
So I think that ties up really well.
That's a great point. In case you guys didn't hear it, Brother Guy talked about the Israelites, the spies that went in there. 10 of them didn't believe, but 2 came back who did believe. But they brought back all these grapes. And he said they never actually experienced it. God had given them basically it. He'd led them through the wilderness with these mighty miracles in Egypt, through the Red Sea. They just had to go and take it. And they didn't. Great point, Matt. Really good point. That was a promise. I mean, it was a promise all the way back to Abraham. I don't want to steal Augustine's thunder there. But they didn't believe. All right. Any other thoughts, questions?
Find it is trusting obedience, trusting God for who he is and what he says is true and for his promises. But then, as we're reading, believing and trusting, but then putting that into action.
Yeah.
So we see that throughout.
Yep. I really like that, and that's more concise, trusting obedience. I do think you need to weave in the promises of God, and because, Hebrews 11:6 does say that we have to believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And isn't that what matters to us? We're walking by faith, or are we walking by sight? Walking by faith. Right? The promises of eternal life, to be the children of God, home in heaven. Can't see that. We can't feel that. But that's what we all believe. And it compels us with trusting obedience to be here tonight. Good point, Tommy. Yes?
Trying to put this. People listed in Hebrews 11, their faith was strong on something that they didn't see, that they believed God. Where we're looking back, we have proof through the Word and everything, and yet it's difficult for some people to have hope and believe.
That's a great point. And the point basically is we have this. They didn't have this. Now, some of them had the scriptures, but in some ways, it's easier for us to look back, right? That's right. So in some ways, we're blessed more so. But to your point, all those men and women of faith, they did. And so we're going to study, it's a great lead-in. We're going to study about each of them for the next for the rest of the quarter. Okay. Okay. The last thing I want to cover is the context leading up to Hebrews chapter 11. And so if you would turn with me to Hebrews chapter 10, and I'll do the reading here, but we're going to read Hebrews chapter 10 and verses, let me see here. I didn't write it down. Okay. Verses 26 through the rest of the chapter. And so read with me. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26. Actually, let me go back up to verse 19. We'll start in verse 19. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he consecrated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. For if we sin willfully, after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much more punishment do you suppose will he be though worthy, who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of their souls. So let me pause. What are the contextual points leading into chapter 11? It starts with there's a confidence, a really amazing confidence that we can draw near to Jesus Christ and his promises. Without reading the whole book, it talks about the old tabernacle and how only the priest once a year could go in the presence of God. And that veil has been torn down because of Jesus Christ. We have a bold confidence we can approach the throne of God. That's one thing. Second, there's a command to encourage one another. Why was the encouragement, for love, good works, and for assembly? Why was that so important to those Christians, which is the third point? Persecution, that's right. They were persecution. They talked about prison, they talked about tribulation, being a spectacle. Apparently they had their things plundered, their property. We know that happened with other Christians in Acts. We know that happened in the book of Revelation with the church of Smyrna and others. Could that happen to us today? Absolutely, it could. All the men and women of faith of Hebrews chapter 11, they went through some form of tribulation, testing, in some cases persecution. There's even one person who was sawed in half. We'll read about that. And so the last point is a call for endurance in the face of persecution. That's the context for us leading in. So now we're going to see this whole cloud of witness throughout the rest of the quarter of those who had that. And then we'll wrap that up with Christians today. So let me pause. Any questions? Matt?
Of course, it's written to Jews who are very familiar with the old customs of Passover and sacrifices and all that. And so it had been several years since Jesus was there. You can imagine that the first few years, people had strong faith. Jesus said, "I'm coming back, he's going to do it." But over time, this is several years now after him, those Jews, particularly facing persecution, are thinking about just going back to their old ways. Maybe that wasn't really, truth. Maybe my faith was for naught. So this book is to encourage them to stick with it.
That's a great point. Great point. And I think we can draw parallels to our own lives. A lot of fire and passion when we became Christians, but the cares of the world, trials of various kind can pull us away. Good point. Yes, Jack.
We're called to endure and suffer, and there's no better time for us to get that into our conviction category in our files and our brain, because we're going to go through a lot of persecuting, suffering. That's the handwriting on the wall.
Appreciate that. Anybody else? All right. That concludes the lesson. I do have homework for everybody. So if we go back, oops. So if you look at these lessons, the good news is we're just going to go sequentially through chapter 11. And we're going to study the men and women of faith. And your job really is, if you will, if you accept your mission, is to just look at the name and put them into your concordance, Blue Letter Bible, stepbible.org, whichever concordance you use, and study about Abel, Enoch, and Noah. Now it's fascinating because obviously those characters are in Genesis. And so we will go to Genesis and we will study them. And it's fun to read it because I personally like reading stories. My kids like reading stories. I won't share the books I read to my twins. They're not literary masterpieces, but they're fun stories. But also in the New Testament, believe it or not, Abel, Enoch, and Noah are referenced in the New Testament quite a bit. And so we can learn a lot. So just type those three names into your concordance. Again, stepbible.org is a great one. Blue Letter Bible's another great one. And then it'll really create an enriching discussion next week. So thank you, everyone.